as a companion piece to the Magpie Stories Classics playlist, I am going to attempt to go back to my teaching roots and deliver a 5-minute talk, speech, educational notes on the text. So it's going to be me, a microphone, a 5-minute timer, and discussion of the texts. So, without further ado, let's try. So, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a classic 19th century text written by Robert Louis Stevenson, primarily exploring the potential evils of science and a move away from a more devout kind of religious ethical aspect to science. Around this time we have publications of things like The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, and there's a general unease in the population about the implications that unlimited scientific progress might have on the corruption of mankind, the divorcing of the ethical and the religious from the scientific. And that was a huge concern. At its heart, Jekyll and Hyde is not necessarily what you would expect from a classic kind of gothic horror tale. It's in fact it's more related to a detective story with our key character Utterson, this incorruptible, kind of brilliant, morally sound lawyer who goes through London trying to work out exactly what has happened to his good friend Dr. Henry Jekyll, who confusingly he calls Harry in various points in the novel, but that's by the by. The novel is presented in such a way that London itself becomes a character we see continually throughout the book, and you'll see this as we go through into further chapters, that this foggy, mysterious, dark aspect of London almost inhabits the background as this malevolent force that always senses danger. You can never quite see what's going to happen. The colours are muted. People appear out of shadows, out of darkness, out of fog, and that element of pathetic fallacy is something that Stevenson taps into incredibly well. We also see this divergence between rich and poor, and the entire novel is set up to have this series of binary opposites, this kind of dichotomy behind it, and this duality of man, and we see that explored, and we'll see that further explored throughout the novel as we read through it. Starting with chapter 1, the story of the door, we have again this sense of duality. We have these two very, very diametrically opposed characters. We have on the one hand like I say, the very reserved, the very austere Utterson, who mortifies his taste for vintages by drinking gin, so he won't allow himself these simple pleasures. He tries to live a very simplistic Puritan life. We even learn that he loves the theatre but hasn't set foot in one for over 20 years, kind of reflecting this idea that he is a cultured man, but he will not allow these vices, these frivolities, to get in the way of his life, this kind of very Victorian dour gentleman. And we have that nicely juxtaposed with Mr. Enfield, who is his cousin, who is outgoing, retells this horrific story, and it's about 3-4 o'clock in the morning. And what we really see here is the development of Hyde. We'll see him grow, in this very first chapter. He will, I say, merely trample an innocent girl, and we'll see how his moral outrages increase as time goes on. But even from the very first appearance of Hyde, we know something is wrong. There is something odd. It's indefinable, but this idea of evil being incorporated on a face, this Satan's signature upon a face, which links to this idea of phrenology, the idea that you could measure somebody's facial features to detect if they would be morally abnormal or not. We see the detective part of this really grow in chapter 2, when Utterson searches for Hyde and finally finds him, and he starts to gather clues and information, and as we find later on in the book, this will eventually be, of course, wrong. but Utterson is absolutely determined to do right by his friend Jekyll, and it's interesting that in the opening we find that he is the very last moral good in the lives of downgoing men, and that is a very, very heavily foreshadowing what will go on in the novel. Now, I could talk further about various different themes, but that will come upon the release of the next video, as I believe I have made it 5 minutes. Blimey, time goes very quickly when you're trying to get through a lot of analysis. So I hope that was a little useful. Some ramblings about the opening 2 chapters of Jekyll and Hyde and a tiny bit of context. I hope to see you again soon. All the best from Magpie Stories.